All right, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We will try to keep this to half an hour because we have the 202 folks joining us at 9, but this is a longer milestone than it was last time. But usually we're able to get through everything. So you've already done your first section of your paper, which included this is the old one, you don't have the abstract anymore, which included your introduction, which includes the purpose of your paper. So the introductory paragraph to any research paper like this generally introduces what the paper is going to be all about. And then section 1 also included the history of the company. So all that's already been done in milestone 1. If you did an abstract, that's okay, Braley. We removed it from the guide because it's not really specified in the rubric. So we thought it made more sense to take it out, but including it is actually probably great practice for future assignments that do require abstracts. So, all right. So now we are on the section titled Supply and Demand Conditions. So when you submit this, you kind of have two choices. You can either submit it just this section, but still include a title page here, or you can just continue adding on to what you've got in milestone 1. If you do choose the latter, to just add on to what you have for milestone 1, just keep in mind that your instructor is not going to be going back and giving you any feedback on any adjustments you made to the first section of the paper. They're only going to be looking at the sections for this milestone 2 because that's what the rubric is aligned with. So if you did make any adjustments to your history, an overview of the company, that portion of the paper, or your introductory paragraph, your instructor will be regrading that as part of your final, but they won't look at it as part of any other milestones. So just to keep that in mind. All right, so our first section is called Supply and Demand Conditions. So we covered supply and demand in this course last week. So hopefully everyone is feeling good about applying these concepts and thinking about what it means for the company that you selected and for the market that they operate in. This section includes 2 critical elements that you're going to be graded on. The first one is asking you to evaluate the trends in demand over time for the product overall. So an example of that is automobiles versus a Ford Focus. You're not looking at the trends in demand for just a Ford Focus. You're looking at the trend in demand for all cars and trucks if you were doing a company like Ford, for instance. If you were doing a company like Coca-Cola, you'd be evaluating the trends in demand for soda and other bottled beverages. If you were doing a company like, let's say, Solar First, you would be looking at the trend in demand for solar panels and other kinds of solar power. So we really want this to be focused on the bigger picture for the whole market and not just for your company in particular, this portion of supply and demand conditions. So Tesla, you could look at it both ways. You could look at it for all automobiles, or you could look at it for electric automobiles. It probably makes more sense just to look at electric automobiles, but you might want to look at both in order to tell a more complete story. But that's up to you, Alex, when you start working on this portion of the paper, which direction you want to go in. I've seen students sort of do both or focus more on electric, but talk briefly about overall trends in demand for automobiles. And I think that's usually the best route. You will probably need a little bit of background information on trend and demand for cars, and generally speaking. So we have listed here the determinants of market demand. So the things that will influence overall demand, that will shift that demand curve. So a lot of what we read and some of what hopefully your instructors talked about in announcements and a lot of our homework questions were about why does that demand curve shift? Either outward increasing demand or inward decreasing demand. So income is one of the things that will impact demand. Generally speaking, the more income people have, the more they demand of anything, if it's a normal good. The price of related goods. So if substitutes of the thing that you're talking about, let's say it's electric vehicles. If non-electric vehicles have a decrease in price, all other things being equal, people might not want Teslas as much. That will impact the demand for electric vehicles, if we use that as an example. Tastes and preferences is a huge one. People in general over time stop liking things, start liking things. There's fads, there's just general trends. So that impacts demand. Population and demographics. General population growth is going to affect demand for things. So that's why oftentimes you see companies just growing. They're not really doing anything different, but they're growing simply because they have more customers to sell to because population is growing. Demographics is looking at a specific portion of the population. Usually it's looking at an age or a gender or even like a race group or even a regional group. So let's say the elderly, right now we have a boom in elderly as the baby boomers are getting older. That group of the population is, a bigger share. So companies that cater to anything having to do with elderly, whether it's a kind of pharmaceutical drug, elder services, general medical care, all that stuff is going to see an increase in demand as that demographic group grows larger. Yeah, Andy. So millennials are another big group of people. So they range in age from about 35 to probably about 20. So that group is very big right now, and they might be big beer drinkers. So we might expect anything that's popular among the 20 to 30 something crowd for those products to see an increase in demand simply because the demographics of the U.S. right now favor that group, millennials, and also baby boomers who are now, in the senior citizen age. So Magdalena asks, how far back do we need to go for the evaluation? That's a great question. And it might not mention it specifically here in this paragraph, but in other portions of this guide, we tend to use 5 years as a good benchmark minimum to really see a trend. A lot of folks, when I've read their papers, tend to go back to maybe about 10 years or at least to the Great Recession, because the Great Recession was kind of a big turning point for a lot of companies. So that's a good place to start telling the story. But 5 years is a good minimum to really see any sort of trend. So if you have a few different years of the annual reports and you read where they talk about their general business, you'll get a sense of a lot of this stuff because they talk about the market in their annual reports. They have in-house, all of these companies have people doing this kind of work that we're asking you to do in this paper. They're looking at how the income of Americans has changed and what that means for demand for their product. They're looking at prices of related goods and what that means for their product. So there are people in these companies doing all of this market analysis, and they present that in their annual report. So when you read about their overall business, they're going to discuss a lot of these things. So you can use that in your research. Alex, no, Tesla is more than 5 years old. So you'll definitely, I think it is. People have been writing about Tesla in this class for at least a couple of years successfully. Otherwise, we wouldn't have put it on the list. So you'll be fine. Awesome. So any other questions about evaluating the trends in demand over time? All right. And yes, Andy, that's true. We are Vermonters in my house. We vacation there, so we drink a lot of craft beer. And it's true. Although I wonder if that's just a fad, the craft beer thing, or if it's going to be a long-lasting development in the beer market. It's something you can explore in your paper. That would be really interesting. All right, so the second rubric element in this section is to analyze information and data related to the demand and supply for your firm's product. So this is where we make the switch from looking at the market overall, all electric vehicles, all beer, all solar panels, to looking specifically at your company, the company that you chose. So the easiest way to start this off, which is why we've outlined it here, is to look at the sales or the revenue for your company. So that's really step one. And that all is provided in the annual reports. So this is one of the many reasons that you have to pick a publicly traded company, because you'll get all of this information through the annual reports that they have to file. All right, so Rob asks, do we recommend actions in this first part or wait until the end of the milestone? That's a great question. So you are not making a recommendation here, but what you outline here is going to support your recommendation in the recommendation section, if that makes sense. So you're sort of setting yourself up to make a recommendation in your conclusion portion of the paper. So when we do this milestone, when we do this webinar for that milestone where you do your conclusion, I'll be reminding you to say, hey, make sure you go back to your other sections and your recommendations are supported by your findings. So it all comes kind of full circle that way. Yes, it was a great question. I agree. Thank you for that one. So be keeping that in mind, that the information that you use here is going to help you think about what the company can do in the future. Okay, great. Hopefully, Braley, this clears that up and is good news. makes the job easier that you're not having to come up with a recommendation right now. Yeah, certainly not. So so you get your sales and revenue, or sales or revenue. This is always presented in dollars, but they might also, in addition to presenting it in dollars, present it in units sold, for instance. So like with Netflix, they show membership numbers. With automobiles, they often show the number of cars sold. With a company like Sam Adams, and a lot of people do Sam Adams or other beer companies, they might talk about barrels brewed, things like that. So definitely show the dollar amount, because that's always going to be available to you. But if you want to, in addition to that, show units sold, that's also a great trend to look at, to see how they're growing in terms of production. Because sometimes you can keep your production largely the same, but if you just are charging a higher price every year, your revenue is going up, but you're not actually making more or really selling more. You're just selling the same amount, but at a higher price. So knowing the difference is important as well in your analysis. All right. Oh, Nat, I'm so sorry to hear that. That does happen to folks sometimes. And usually what works is just to log out and log back in. If you miss anything, the recording will be in our class tomorrow. All right, so that portion is pretty easy. You're just gathering the data. And then once you've gathered it, you can discuss it a little bit, see what's happening, and give some of the background info about why it's, why is it going up or down. And again, this is where we mention to at least get 5 years of data. You might want to get more. So for a company like Netflix, where they had really strong growth, and in a short period of time, you might show it better if you go back more than 5 years, because now 5 years they might be on a more normal trajectory. But I feel like at the beginning, if I remember the data correctly, there was like big jumps in those first few years where they started moving away from DVD and more to streaming. So if you feel that you need more than 5 years to tell the full story of your company, then by all means, please go beyond 5 years. All right, and then from there, to sort of help you explain and go into a bit more detail about how your company is supplying their product, goods and services. You're going to talk about some things that are pretty basic, like how do they produce the stuff that they produce? Where do they produce it? Any sort of methodology or technology that they use, you could discuss here. And then also, this is where you can find ways to bring in the determinants of supply. And this affects how much they're looking to supply in general. Input costs are a major driver of how much companies supply. Technological improvements will be a driver. Prices of substitutes will impact supply. Number of firms in the market. So that's a great one for those of you doing the beer. I know that craft beer breweries are popping up all over the place, and that impacts how much any one brewery can supply. and expected future prices. So these things are all outlined in your book. You don't have to go over each of these, but this is just to give you an idea of some of the things you could talk about in terms of the company's approach to supplying their product. So Lindsay asks, what is a good website to get more than 5 years of financial info? Lindsay, all you have to do is go back and get older financial annual reports. So if you want to go, let's say what year we're in. So 2016 is the latest one for all these companies. Now that we're at the end of 2017, they've all come out. So if you go back to, let's say 2011 or let's say 2011. 2011 annual report will have data on sales and revenue for 2010, 2009. They always give at least 3 years in the annual reports of back data. Sometimes they give 5. So if you have a 2011 report, you'll have 2011, 2010, 2009, maybe 2008 and 2007. And you can go back pretty far and find them. If not on the investor page of their website, just try and Google it. If you're having trouble finding it on their investor page or Googling it, you can contact the Shapiro Library for help and they can help you look it up. And then Net asks, do I make a graph and add in the insert into my paper? Yeah, Net, that's a great idea. So you can, usually it's presented in the annual report, just in the table. But as we said here, we are asking you to include a graph. So you have the numbers. So you've got 5 or more years of annual revenue. And it's very simple to just in Excel, or you can even do it right in Word. I find it easier to just do it in Excel and copy paste it into Word, but you can just make a simple line graph or bar chart and pop it into your paper. If you find something online that's from a reputable source, whether it's from the annual report itself or from maybe the company website that shows in graph the revenue for 5 or more years, making sure that you go all the way up through 2016. Do not leave out 2016. You can borrow that graph from your source and pop that into your paper. Just either way, you're going to have to cite it. If you make your own graph, you're citing the data that you got from elsewhere. If you use somebody else's graph, you're citing where you got the graph from. But yeah, it's definitely very important to use 2016. So Lori asks, so in that case, couldn't you use the 2016 report and have your 5 years worth of data? Lori, yes, if 2016, like I said, some companies in their annual reports list only 3 years of data when it comes to sales and costs. Some list 5, so it depends on the company. And maybe you want to go more than 5 years. And also, I think it's valuable to pull up some of the older ones, 2015, 2014, 2013, and just read what they were talking about. Usually the part of the annual report where they just discuss the business and, sort of the market that they're in is only maybe 5 pages long. So it's helpful to read through that and see how what they're talking about has changed each year. The things that they're focusing on, who their competitors are, what they see going on in the market. Obviously we're in this paper, we're acting as consultants, but we all know that they have people doing that in-house and that are expert at this. So you're going to get a lot of valuable information just from reading what they have to say. They hire consultants to do this kind of stuff for them. So this is a pretty reasonable scenario. And I've been that consultant that does this kind of work for a company. So it's all that stuff that is in annual reports is stuff that you could borrow and apply here because they're doing similar work. So Rob B asks, so the goal of this section is to explain how my company is providing their product and how unique it is. The first part, yes, how the company is providing their product. So how much, how are they producing it? How have any of these determinants of supply impacted them? You can get into a little bit of how unique it is. I wouldn't go too far down that road just yet here, because when you get into our section on overall market, you might want to save that for that section where you talk about how they compare to their competitors and stuff. If you feel it's important to discuss that here, then absolutely do that. But I wouldn't say that that's the focus of this necessarily, talking about how unique the product is. But if it fits into the narrative that you need to tell, then by all means include it. All right. And you can also talk about how they're in this section, how they're sourcing things. So, how does Starbucks source its beans and its milk? Any of the inputs that go into that. You're going to talk about costs of input in our next milestone, but if you just want to talk about their general business practices of how they bring together all that they need to produce their goods and services, then you can also explore that here. All right, so we have our next section to talk about, which is 3 elements long. And this is price elasticity of demand section. So this is what we covered in week 3 of class. And the first element here is asking for you to analyze information and data to justify how the price elasticity of demand for your product is determined. So basically what we need you to do here is to say, is demand for my product elastic or inelastic? So we practiced this a little bit in our discussion on gasoline, where in essence, you were asked to say, okay, is demand for gasoline elastic or inelastic? And give some reasons why. This is sort of broken up into 2 elements. So the second element here is looking at the determinants of price elasticity of demand. So that's one way that's going to support whether demand is elastic or inelastic. And that was one of the things we practiced in our discussion last week as well. But this first element wants you to first focus on pricing information and data, that kind of information to justify whether demand is inelastic or elastic. And then you'll follow up with the determinants. So there's a couple of ways to approach this. You can look at pricing information, and you might, although the expectation is that you probably won't have access to this information, but you could do an actual calculation of price elasticity. So you find two prices, you find a price change, and then you find the resulting quantity change and you do the calculation like we practiced in the textbook. The likelihood of you having access to that kind of information is small. There's a couple instances in a particular year where you might have access to that. I think, Netflix is one example where they had a very well publicized and well analyzed price change, and people were able to talk about how that impacted demand for Netflix subscriptions. And so the calculation was pretty easy to do because that information was made public. But for most of you, that's not a reality. So you won't be able to do an outright calculation and say the price elasticity of demand is, 1.4. So don't set yourself up thinking that you have to do that. You can look at pricing data in some other ways, though. Does your company often offer sales? Do they compete on price with their competitors consistently? Things like that will indicate either elastic or inelastic demand. When companies don't compete on price, when they don't ever offer discounts, you can think about like luxury brands, things like that. Well, actually, that's probably not the best example, but maybe like your utility company isn't offering a sale 1 month on electricity. They know that they don't need to do that to get people to buy electricity. Demand is very inelastic for something like electricity or for water. But jeans go on sale all the time. Black Friday is a holiday I should have called that, is a day that in essence shows that demand for a lot of those products is very elastic, which is why they show sales. So that's the kind of information you can look at to say, okay, this points to elastic demand or this points to inelastic demand. When companies always try to undercut each other on price, that also points to elastic demand. They know that they have to stay competitive on price or people won't continue to buy their product, where some other products, that's not as much of a concern, either because they don't have a lot of competition or because people are very brand conscious and don't care, and they'll stick with the brand no matter how expensive it is compared to substitutes. You can also look at other kind of data. such as research on the product. So almost all of the products or services on our suggested companies list have some research out there done by economists to find the price elasticity of demand for them. So you can find research on the price elasticity of demand for coffee, just coffee in general, not coffee from Starbucks, not Folgers coffee, but coffee in general. You can find price elasticity of demand for air travel, for automobiles, for gasoline, maybe even for clothing, for certain food items. Lots of research has been done by this by professional economists. So feel free to piggyback off their work and include that in this section of your paper. If you find out that demand for coffee is elastic, I'm not saying that it is, but if that's what you found research that said that, then you can extrapolate that. Okay, what does that mean for my paper on Starbucks? If coffee overall has elastic demand, what does that mean for demand for Starbucks coffee? So you can use that as sort of a jumping off point. All right, I see some activity in the chat, so let me make sure I haven't missed anything. Coupons, yeah. So Lori, and a company that gives out coupons a lot would be one indication that demand for their product might be elastic. Yep. Definitely. And you'll notice that like a lot of food products have coupons. You know, you get your flyer for the grocery store. Obviously, food overall is not, is not elastic. The demand for it is not elastic. We need food. It's a necessity. If all food prices went up 20% tomorrow, people would probably still eat about the same amount of food. They might shift what they eat though. So when companies offer coupons on their chicken nuggets or on their cheese or whatever, food, their cereal, they're trying to get you to pick their particular product out of all the food products you have to choose from. So this is where we go into definition of market. And that's one of the determinants. So that's actually a good segue. So the next section, and this should all align with whether you said demand was elastic or inelastic, is the determinants. So again, we talked about this in our discussion. Our textbook outlines 5 determinants of price elasticity of demand. And if you thought about what these mean for gasoline, you could do the same exercise for your company, for your company's product. But keep in mind that some things, one of these determinants might say, oh, demand should be elastic. But another determinant might say, well, demand should be inelastic. So maybe you have a good that there's lots of available substitutes. So that means demand would be fairly elastic, all other things equal. But it's also a necessity. That would point to inelastic demand. So in your analysis, you kind of have to shake out, well, this points this way, this points that way, but overall, it goes this way because certain ones of these will have more of an impact than others. And that's very much specific to the product that you're thinking about, or that you're analyzing. So don't worry if everything doesn't point in the same direction. It's okay if different things lead you in a different path because one is going to have a bigger impact than the other. And in the end, it should all align with what you discussed in the first element. All right, so Andy said he found it. He asked if the PDF you're using is in the week 4 module. Yeah, Andy, this is not in the module folder, unfortunately. It is, for those of you who might be curious, in Andy's position. If you go to the final project supplemental resources, this is where you would find that. So the other determinants of price elasticity of demand are, besides definition of the market, are availability of substitutes, passage of time, luxury or necessity, and share of budget. And we are past 9 o'clock. So 201 students, I'd love to get through this last one if you can hang out. Students who are here for 202, I'm so sorry. This is a longer milestone for them. And if you can hang on just a few minutes until we finish up, we'll switch over to 202 as soon as we're done. Thanks. So with the food definition, if we used food as the whole market, demand, that's a very wide definition. So demand is going to be very inelastic. But if we go smaller and we say, okay, meat, okay, then now we're getting a little bit more elastic demand. And then we say, all right, chicken. All right, now we've narrowed it even further. Demand is getting more elastic. And now we say, okay, Tyson chicken. Now demand is much more elastic, whereas food overall has very inelastic demand. So you see, as you narrow the definition of the market, the demand is going to get much more elastic. So it's like clothing overall versus Levi's jeans, automobiles overall versus Ford Focus. So the narrower you get, the more elastic the demand will, price elasticity of demand will be. So Amanda asks, I chose Nike. Should I focus on athletic shoes or shoes in general? Sneakers, yeah, athletic shoes. But they also do apparel as well. So you might want to look at apparel if you feel that you have the bandwidth to include those products. But obviously sneakers is their flagship product. So it makes sense to start there. Awesome. All right. And lastly, this element is asking you to assess how the price elasticity of demand impacts the firm's pricing decisions. So what this is getting at is, how does a company decide to increase prices or decrease prices? Like, why would they give a coupon, right? Lori mentioned coupons. What prompts that pricing decision? What role does price elasticity of demand play in those decisions? And one explanation for that is the relationship between price elasticity of demand and total revenue. So we've got a link to the video in our textbook here that explains what that's all about. It's a pretty straightforward relationship. When demand is elastic, that means people are very responsive to a price change. If you drop the price, you're actually going to increase your revenue. That's why there's sales. They're trying to get more people in the door, people buying a lot more stuff. They're giving coupons. People buy all the stuff that there's a coupon for, and they end up selling so much more that it makes up for the lower price that they're selling it at. The opposite is true for inelastic demand. When demand is inelastic, people don't respond much to a price change, whether it's up or down. So if you put a sale on something that's got inelastic demand, people will decrease how much they buy a little bit, but not by, they'll increase how much they buy by a little bit because the price is lower, but not by that much because they're just not very responsive to a price change. They buy how much they need to buy, and that's about it, regardless of the price. So you've lowered your price, but not made up for it on quantity. So you see your revenue go down. So that's the general relationship. So you're just going to apply that. I'm talking about it very broadly. You're going to talk about it in specific terms of your company. So you'll obviously have to know if it's elastic or inelastic, which is why it's so important to call it out earlier in this section, and then say what that means for revenue, and look at some of their pricing decisions. Have they been offering sales or coupons? Have they increased their price? When their prices increase for inputs, do they pass that price on to the customer, or do they try not to? And how did price elasticity play a role in that decision? So those are the things you could talk about here. All right. Since we are 5 minutes over and we've got some 202 students waiting for us, if 201 students have any last minute questions, I'll be happy to take them. Otherwise, best of luck. And if anything comes up after tonight that's burning a hole in your brain, a question you really need answered, absolutely go to your instructor. They're your best resource because they're the ones that are going to be reading your paper, and you want to make sure that you're meeting their expectations. And happy Thanksgiving. Thank you all so much for coming. All right. Thank you, 202 students, for sharing 5 minutes with our microeconomics peers. All right. Nat, I'm glad you're feeling a little bit better. Yeah, and if, like I said, if any questions come up, just please email your instructors as soon as the thought enters your mind if you have a question. This is the stuff we love to talk about, so. Go Cowboys. Go Patriots. I know, we're not playing on Thursday. All right, thank you guys. All right. All right, well, welcome macroeconomics students. Let me make sure I pull up your correct document. Yes, here we go. All right, let's scroll up to where we need to be. Now, compared to our last milestone, this one is a little bit shorter. You only have 3 critical elements, and it's not quite the same data dump that you had to do before. So I hope that that you're feeling good coming into this. So this week we are exploring fiscal policy, and that is what your milestone is focused on as well. And a lot of what you will be employing here is going to rely on 2 things: research that you do, and the macroeconomic models that we learned about last week in week 3, namely aggregate demand, aggregate supply, but also the Keynesian model as well. I find the aggregate demand, aggregate supply is a little easier to work with, so and it's more versatile. So I tend to direct students that way because for me, I feel like it works in more situations, but that's the bulk of what you're going to be working on here. So make sure that you feel comfortable with that aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and that you've got a good handle on the research, or at least the right steps in place. If you haven't worked with the Shapiro Library yet, now would definitely be a good time to reach out if you think you might need some help gathering the research that you need for this portion of the paper. Of the project. So the first critical element here is asking you to look at fiscal policies in place at the start of your chosen time period. So first of all, what is fiscal policy? So that's what we're learning this week. But essentially, it's the spending decisions made by the federal government. So when Congress, like right now, actually, this is a great example. Right now, Congress is looking to pass tax reform, and that would be considered a major fiscal policy. So if this goes through, that would be a huge fiscal policy event, namely because they're changing the tax rates on a variety of things. It's a really big bill, so there would be a lot to talk about if you were doing this project a year from now and this passes. But you're going to be looking for similar things that were in place at the start of your chosen time period. So what were tax rates set at for a variety of things? What was the tax policy? And what was the spending policy? So there are 2 ways that the federal government sort of manages the money. It's through how they levy taxes. That's how they get their money, right? And then how they spend the money that they get, so government spending. And they spend their money in a variety of ways. Now, some of those spending decisions aren't really based on trying to make an economic choice, right? So the government might spend money on, buying new tanks for the military. They're not really doing that because, oh gosh, the economy needs a boost. They're doing that for other reasons. It certainly might have an impact on the economy, but we might not necessarily consider it a fiscal policy action, even though it's government spending. But fiscal policies are where the government is looking to make an impact on the economy. So those are the things you want to mainly focus on. So let's say you're doing the 90s. So 1990 is the start of your chosen decade. You might need to look at policies that were passed in 88 or 89 in order to give a full picture of what fiscal policy looked like in 1990. Because legislation takes time, and these policies don't change necessarily every year. So to see what's happening at the start of the 90s, you might need to see what legislation was passed just prior to the start of your time period. So just something to keep in mind. And when you do your research, it's probably easiest to search by president instead of by the year. So if you type in, fiscal policy 1990, you might not get a lot of information. But if you type in, fiscal policy George Bush Sr., then you're going to get a lot of information, whether you just do a random Google search or if you use the Shapiro Library. And we've got some starting off points here. The Congressional Budget Office looks at all sorts of different government legislation and policies to see what their impact on the economy was. So you can read up about that here. The White House website also has some history of different legislation passed under past presidents on their website. And the National Bureau of Economic Research has some free papers to read, and a lot of their research is on policy initiatives. So you can, those are just some starting off points. And again, the Shapiro Library is going to be great for this. So once you've gathered up your research, you're going to just briefly describe, what were these policies in place and why were they put into place? What economic impact were they trying to have? Were they responding to a certain event? Were they trying to encourage growth? You can explain that briefly to satisfy this rubric element. All right, and then on the second element here, it's looking at fiscal policy actions. So this is fairly the same as the element you just did, except that you're going to be seeing how those policies change over the 10-year time period. So like I said, they might not change every year, but every 2 years we get a new crop of House of Representatives that are going to try to pass new legislation. Every 4 years, of course, we have another presidential election, and every 6 years we vote in new senators. So as all those changes happen, we see different legislative priorities. So there's always going to be some handful of changes that take place throughout a 10-year time period in terms of fiscal policy. So there's always something to talk about. And you're going to find out what those legislative actions were. You're going to describe them just like you did above. And here we're going to take it one step further, and we're going to try to incorporate those macroeconomic models that we were introduced to last week. So like I said here, we've got the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. That's your workhorse. We also have the Keynesian consumption function, which can be applicable in certain situations or certain policies if you want to include that. So you're going to explain how these models back up these decisions by the federal government. So why did Congress decide to do X, Y, Z in terms of their fiscal policy? What did they see happening in the economy that they felt that this would be a good response in terms of changing taxes or changing spending? So this week, you'll learn how fiscal policy actions relate to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, so you can make those connections. If you're kind of tech savvy and you're maybe familiar with PowerPoint, you can even draw your own aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph to show a shift in the aggregate demand curve to show the fiscal policy action taking place in our model. The nice thing about using that is you don't have to use numbers on the price level or the GDP, the output axes. You can just label them, output and price level, and you just want to show a shift. So, how does price level change when this new fiscal policy action takes place? How does output change? So you can just easily show that with, showing a shift in the aggregate demand curve, and then you can discuss it in your speaker notes. You can also just say what would happen if you don't feel that you can draw a graph and do it justice on PowerPoint. I understand that too. So if you want to just discuss what would happen in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and then elaborate on that in your speaker notes, that's another option as well. And you're also going to try to incorporate some scholarly research here. Of course, a lot of what you're doing in terms of just gathering information about these policy actions is going to be a big chunk of your scholarly research. But you can also talk about, what any research you find that says, okay, at the time, this is what was happening in the economy, and this is what, economists or legislators were saying about the need for a tax cut or a spending increase or a spending decrease to respond to the economy. All those things would count here as scholarly research. All right, I see someone typing, so keep on typing and we'll address your question. I'll hang out on this slide just in case it's about this one. Just as a note, you might need more than one slide for this element, especially if you have a time period where there was lots of fiscal policy action. some time periods are more active in this arena than others. So if there are some big legislative actions that you feel might warrant their own slide each, you can break it up that way. If you don't feel you can squeeze it all into one slide. All right, now I see a couple of people typing. I want to make sure I don't miss any questions before I move on to the last element. So Katie asks, how many fiscal policy actions should we aim to discuss? Unfortunately, it's difficult for me to give you a number. You should definitely, and this is going to sound like a throwaway answer, but you should definitely cover the main ones. So, and you should definitely cover the entire time period. So let's say you find two big fiscal policy actions and you're doing the 80s. If they both happened before 1985, you're not done. Because certainly there was something that happened between 1985 and 1989 that you should want to talk about. Because like I said, there's always, every couple of years, there's a new crop of legislators coming out with things. So you might only talk about 2 or 3 things. And as long as they span a good portion of your time period, then you've done a good job. If you find a couple things that all happen, that were all voted on in one year, then you haven't really given the full picture of fiscal policy actions in your time period. So that's one way to look at it. Make sure you're investigating the entire time period and looking for something throughout, looking for examples throughout it. And look for things that, like I said, that are main actions, a big one. So if they do one little small thing, like, oh, they increased spending on this small little program and it was, $10 million. $10 million of federal government spending is very small. So if you talked about all things like that, it wouldn't be stuff that's really moving the dial. So you want to focus on the bigger legislative actions. Usually, like one option to sort of narrow it down, and again, don't cite this, but it's a good starting point. You can go to look up your president on Wikipedia, the president or presidents that were in office in your time period, and on their Wikipedia page, they're almost always going to have a section on this stuff for them, their economic policy. So it will discuss the major legislative actions they had around economic policy. And you can find the ones that would be considered fiscal policy and discuss those. You'll know what they are, and then you can go get proper research for them instead of relying on Wikipedia. But Wikipedia can kind of be your springboard. So that might be a good way to find the major ones and help you narrow it down. All right, so Deborah Clark says, I had a problem uploading my PowerPoint, showing my speaker notes and my graphs together. What might have been the problem? So Deborah, I'm not sure, without seeing it, to be honest, I'm not sure what the problem is. If that happens again, you can always call the help desk and they can walk you through it. If you tried to save it as a PDF and you lost your speaker notes somehow, you can just submit it as a regular PowerPoint and your instructor will just have to download it to see your speaker notes. But if you submit it that way, then at least they can read it by downloading it and you won't lose the speaker notes. So Chris says, no speaker notes on template. I'm sure there is a way to add the section, still figuring it out. Chris, that might have been in response to Deborah, so forgive me if that wasn't a question. Looks like everyone's responding to Deborah. Gosh, you guys are so helpful. Sorry, I should read all of them before I start answering. Yeah, so there's a video, I believe it's included in Module 2. It's actually a video I created. You'll probably recognize my voice. About how to save it to save the PowerPoint as a PDF showing the notes. But if it didn't work out for you for any reason, I don't want you to lose points. You can just submit it as a PowerPoint. And like I said, your instructor has the ability in Blackboard to download it, and then they can see your whole file and see the speaker notes. Or like I said, you can call the help desk and they can help you work it out if anyone's having trouble with that. And you should also, if I recall correctly, once you submit, I don't know how long it takes, but once you submit in Blackboard, you should be able to see your submission and see what the instructor sees. So that you can kind of check it that way to see if it went through properly. All right. Thank you, guys. All right. So the last, I think it's definitely easier for your instructor if you submit it as a PDF with the notes, because then they can see right in Blackboard your slide and your speaker notes below it. So if they want to leave you any inline comments, they can do so right there on the screen. If they want to highlight something that you wrote about in your speaker notes and say, hey, give you some feedback on something specific right there in the submission, that makes it a lot easier, and it makes their grading faster. So they'll turn around your grades faster if everybody submits that way. So that's why we try to encourage students to do it. That's weird, Deborah. It didn't show, so it showed your slides, just the graphs disappeared. That's unexpected. So yeah, maybe don't risk it next time. You don't want to lose all your information. Yeah. Very weird. Okay. So our last element is the fiscal policy impact. So you've outlined what all the fiscal policy actions were, or the major ones were in your time period. So now you're going to see, were any of them effective? And basically, how did they impact the economy in the end? Did they increase growth rates? Did they increase consumer spending? Did they increase business investment? Did they increase, maybe you could even look at things, we haven't started this yet, but for your final draft, you could even look at things like how exports and imports and exchange rates were impacted. So, and each legislative action, so let's say you look at 3, just to throw out a number, each one might have had a different impact on the economy, or they might have been designed to sort of work together to have one same big impact on the economy. So depends on, again, it always depends on your time period and which actions you're looking at, but you'll want to discuss how they impacted businesses, how they impacted households, and how they impacted the economy overall. So you have a lot of the data on the overall economy from your first milestone. So you can see GDP for every year, you can see unemployment for every year, you can see inflation and interest rates for every year. So it's great. You can leverage that research that you've already done, and then you can look at some more specific things, like, if there was a tax cut for an income tax cut, well, did we see an increase in consumption? You can go get that data. Are households spending more money, or are they saving more money with that tax cut? Are they paying off their credit cards with that tax cut? You can find that kind of information. Businesses, corporations got a tax cut. What did they do? Did they hire a lot more people? Did we see unemployment go down? Did they do a lot of stock buybacks instead? Did they invest in a bunch of robots? You can find out that information through your research and through some of the data that you've already gathered. So Jim, I wouldn't necessarily say you have to break down each one, but if they each had different impacts on the economy, if they were targeted at different things, or if they were timed very separately, then you might need to look at each of their impacts separately. So, if there was a fiscal policy action in 1982, and then another one in 1985, and then another one in 1989, probably you want to talk about their impact separately, if that makes sense. But let's say, if you're doing the 2000 to 2009, there might have been a couple of fiscal policy actions that you want to talk about that happened in 2008 and 2009 in response to the Great Recession. So you might be able to talk about those couple that happened sort of simultaneously together, if that makes sense, because they were probably put in place all for the same same overall goal. Yeah. All right. And usually students do this one in just one slide. If you feel like Jim says, if you want to break out the impact of each one separately, feel free to do that. If you don't think you can fit it all into one slide and have the slide look nice. All right. And then as always, make sure you have your references listed. And just like in a paper, you need in-text citations. So in-text citations right on the slide, and in-text citations in your speaker notes as applicable. So anything that is information that you got from an outside source, whether you're putting it on the slide or you're putting it in your speaker notes, just needs to have an in-text citation and then a follow-up full reference. So Trina asks, do we add these slides to Milestone 1 or we just submit these slides? Trina, that is entirely up to you. Do include a title slide either way, and which you already have for Milestone 1, but if you just submit these slides, keep a title slide in there. If you do submit with Milestone 1, just keep in mind that your instructor is not going to go look for any adjustments you made to Milestone 1. So if you did make adjustments, they're not going to give feedback on that. They're not going to regrade that just yet. They will do that for the final submission. Chris asks, do the in-text citations have to be on the slide or just in the notes? It depends on what you're saying. Anything you say on the slide, anything you put on the slide that is information that you got from a source, then you need to cite it on the slide. If your speaker notes have something that you got from a source, then you need to use an in-text citation there in the speaker notes. So you're going to have a lot of in-text citations, obviously, because a lot of this is research that you had to do. I don't expect, anybody to know what the name of a fiscal policy was in 1983, right? You had to look that up, so then you have to cite it. But something you wouldn't have to cite is like if you discuss aggregate demand, aggregate supply model and what the shift would be based on a fiscal policy. That's something you're applying what you learned in class. So that's coming from you. So you wouldn't cite that. If you borrowed a graph showing an aggregate demand shift from a website or even from our textbook, then you would cite it. But if you draw your own and just discuss the shift, that's something you would not cite. So Femi asks, can we pull fiscal policies from outside of the United States? Femi, the focus of this presentation is on the U.S. fiscal policy and how our government's economic policies are impacting the economy. So for now, for this portion, we're just looking at U.S. fiscal policies. We will, if there were policy decisions made by other countries that had a major impact on our economy, you can talk about it if you need to make revisions to stuff we discussed in Milestone 1. So if it impacted for some reason GDP here, our economy's growth, you could mention that as an event or a factor of our economy's growth. We'll also have in our final submission some stuff on trade and exchange rates. So if that's a more likely place to discuss other countries' policy actions, then maybe save it for then, if that makes sense. It all depends on what the policy is, so it's hard for me to be too specific. But so Christina asks, do we need to address the monetary policy slide? No. So that's your next milestone, which is next week. So next week we cover monetary policy, and we'll also do our milestone for that then. Yep, so monetary policy is anything that the Federal Reserve does. So if you're doing your research and you come across something that says the Federal Reserve did XYZ, do not include that in this milestone. It's monetary policy, save it for next week. So save it. If you find that, it's great, bookmark it, print it out, save it in your files, whatever your method is, but don't discuss that here in the fiscal policy section. So the fiscal policy section is really just government spending and taxation. All right. And that's all she wrote for this one. So does anybody have any other questions before I let you go for the Thanksgiving holiday? Jim, I'm glad to hear it. You're welcome, Christina. Oh, Jacqueline, you're so nice. Thank you. Awesome. Well, great. Sounds like there are no outstanding questions. So everybody enjoy your holiday. I know it's kind of a bummer to have this due on a holiday week, but thankfully it's a shorter one, and all this new resources are going to be available today. Well, today's almost over, but tomorrow, Thursday is a holiday for us, but the Shapiro Library, I believe all those resources should be available on Friday and over the weekend as per usual. So enjoy your turkey. Enjoy the fixins if you're not a meat eater. Enjoy your shopping if that's part of your plan over the weekend, and best of luck on your milestone. Yes, Femi, this I will share this out. So I'll show you guys a little secret that I just showed the other group. I will usually, because I have to download the recording and I have to edit it to make it YouTube compatible, I will get it up sometime in the following morning. So sometime tomorrow morning, I'll be able to post this on YouTube once I convert it. And then it will be listed on our SNU Eco channel. So I'll send out the link to the video to all of the instructors to pop into your classroom so they can share it with you guys. But it will also be on the Eco channel. So what you can do is, if you don't feel like waiting for your instructor to share it, is you can come back here and you can click right where it says here, and that will bring you to the SNU Eco channel. And usually by about 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, I've got the video up on YouTube, and that's when I email it out to all the instructors. So you can get a head start and check out this link around 10 o'clock in the morning and grab it then if you want it early. Yes, Katie, do not include monetary policy. So we haven't covered monetary policy yet. So if you're like, I don't know what that is, how do I know not to include it? It's anything that has to do with the Federal Reserve, anything that has to do with money supply or setting of interest rates. All that stuff is monetary policy, and all that stuff waits till next week. So if you find it, hang on to it and save it for then. All right, and you can come back here to the webinar and you'll find this screen up, and you can click here, come to the SNU Eco channel on YouTube, and grab the recording of this if you need it. All right, thank you all so much, and have a fantastic holiday week. Email your instructors if you have any questions, and be sure to use the Shapiro Library if you need any assistance with getting your research done.